Okay, so just while we're waiting, I'll just mention that during today's webinar, please ask your questions for Professor Paxinos via the Q&A function, and these will be answered at the end of the presentation. And the chat feature has been disabled, so questions should be sent via the Q&A feature. So I think that the participant numbers have kind of stabilized at the moment, so we might get started. So welcome to today's Monash Biomedical Imaging webinar with Professor George Paxinos. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land Monash University is positioned, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'll now hand over to the Director of Monash Biomedical Imaging, Professor Gary Egan, to introduce Professor Paxinos. Gary.
Thanks very much, Shana. Hello, everybody. And today it's a real pleasure that we have Professor George Paxinos presenting to us as a webinar. George is actually physically at MBI, but this is how we do it now. So we're doing it by Zoom. It's really fantastic to have you visiting, George. You know, we've been long-standing research collaborators, and I've been a great admirer of your work over many decades. So really great to sort of be catching up. George studied at Berkeley, McGill and Yale, and he's now the Scientia Professor of Medical Sciences at Neuroscience Research Australia and at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. George has discovered 94 brain regions and 64 homologies and published 58 books, his first being The Rat Brain in Stereotaxic Coordinates, which is one of the most cited publications in neuroscience, and for 3 decades was actually the 3rd most cited book in science. So it's amazing, George, the impact that your research has had. It's great to have your presentation today, which I know will be stimulating and thought-provoking and maybe controversial. And the title of it is Brain and Mind, Who is the Puppet and Who is the Puppeteer? Thanks very much, George.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Shana. If I could start with a quote from Mark Twain. I always get embarrassed when they introduce me. They never say enough. Now, share screen, all right? And brain and mind, who is the puppet and who the puppeteer? And you can see here. Another way to look at it is why psychology lost its soul. And I will tell you something about my journey through the brain, some historical aspects of neuroscience relative to mind, soul, consciousness, free will, and then something about the way I used concepts in neuroscience to write a novel. The creation of the heroes by using principles of neuroscience. A River Divided is a novel in the eco-fiction genre that broke a record in the time it took me to complete, 21 years. You will find things in there, such questions such as, is the brain the right size, in quotes, for survival? You will hear Professor Eastbrook talk about principles of neuroscience, free will, determinism, genes, that is nurture and nature. You will see the characters of the novel display some of these principles. Now, I have some credentials in neuroscience. I actually was a student at Berkeley when my very old professor, he was getting the emeritus status the year I arrived, told us that he was a student of the PhD student of Wilhelm Wundt. So I shook the hand that shook the hand that shook the hand of Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of psychology in Leipzig, 1879. So anybody who's here at the Monash the Monash Center will be able to have this connection directly with the founder of psychology. Also, the issue of the atlases that Gary mentioned, that atlas is 40 years old today, the rat brain stereotaxic coordinates. And in a neuroscience meeting a few years back, a lady who had used the atlas as a PhD student back then when it first came out was at the meeting, and I introduced myself to her, and she said, "George Paxinos, I thought you were dead." We started with a rat, and we produced stereotaxic grid. And the reason that we managed to make some progress with a rat was that we used a good stain that displayed the brain far better than anything used before. This was acetylcholinesterase, and you can see here the temporal lobe, the basal ganglia of the monkey in this case, and how the stain is distributed, sometimes intensely in some regions, and sometimes not at all, with many gradations. So you can actually do the outline of the brain regions without being a neuroanatomist, as I wasn't then. I was a psychologist. But I saw the stain, and that had consequence. That decision of using the stain actually influenced what I did from then on, because once the rat atlas went well, it was, I thought it would be an easy step to do the human. Little did I know that I would still be doing human brain atlases. And so it was acetylcholinesterase. And here you can see Floyd Bloom at that time saying the gain in the brain is mainly in the stain. And here, I don't always stain the mouse brain, but when I do, I prefer acetylcholinesterase. And you might say the rat is fine, but really the game is on the human. And I thought of constructing an atlas of the human brain, given that the rat went well. But I thought before trying the human, I should get another primate that would allow me to study the brain in better conditions, not with long periods post-mortem, as it is the case with the human, that you have to wait until 8 hours at least. And I wrote to the Taronga Park Zoo. Now I show you a picture of on orangutan because I didn't have a chimpanzee pose for me. But I wrote to the Taronga Park Zoo to give me an opportunity to do a postmortem on a chimpanzee brain once a chimpanzee died. They responded that they would be happy to oblige, but they had not had the death of a chimpanzee in the zoo for a decade. 2 months after receiving my letter, 3 chimpanzees died. Luckily, they didn't suspect me, and I studied the brainstem of one of them, and that led us really to study subsequently the human, knowing what to expect in the human. And when we looked at the 2 brains, we found no nuclei that existed in one and did not exist in the other. And again, it was acetylcholinesterase that you can see here in the brainstem, the hypoglossal nucleus, the dorsomotor nucleus of vagus, the 10th nucleus, the inferior olive, of course, there, the ambiguous nucleus. You can see them clearly. If you look at Nissel, what other people were using up to that point, the principal way of studying the brain, you don't see them as well. And certainly, it's hard to see this nucleus here, which was staring at me for 30 years in acetylcholinesterase. In Nissel, you can see it once you know it exists. Then you can see it. In acetylcholinesterase, it is far clearer. It's here, what we name the endorestiform nucleus, because it's inside the restiform body. But again, it was really the stain that made us neuroanatomists and not any knowledge of it. It was just a step ahead. And it still is using the right combination of stains. You can identify things easier than the other way. And you might say, well, that's fine for the subcortex, but who really cares about the subcortex? It's really the cortex that people are interested in. And there's a good map of the cortex, the human cortex, and it's von Economo, just there, and Koskinas that produced this beautiful map of the cytoarchitecture of the human cortex. Yet that map, which is far better than the Brodmann map, is not used. And it's instead a far inferior map, the Brodmann, that is used. But we did use it. And really, this is principally the work of Marcelo Rosa here, who studies marmoset, and worked with him to produce an atlas of the marmoset brain. And the marmoset, you can see, it is a primate the size of a small rat, but it has a primate brain. And in fact, it is hard to find any difference in even the cortex between the human and the marmoset. And then again, it was Marcello's work that you see here in a side view of the cortex. There are people who compared directly the cortex of the human and the rhesus monkey, and again, they found no difference. That is Petrindis and Pandya, with whom I worked. And you might say, of course, even areas 45A and 45B, that you actually, they're speech areas. Are you really insisting that you're finding subdivisions of the speech area, Broca's area, in the rhesus monkey or the marmoset? Well, the principle is that the other side of the right side of the human brain does not subserve speech to any large extent, and yet there exists areas 45A and 45B, though they're not involved, especially with speech. And on that basis, the monkey doesn't speak to us, but if it has cytoarchitectonically, chemoarchitectonically, connectionally, the same profile to the areas that in the human on the left side is called Broca's, we will call them by the same cytoarchitectonic name, that is homologous. And we've tried a bit more on the human cortex with Jürgen May in this atlas that came out in 2016, but we're still not quite satisfied that we're not satisfied we've done a good job. Now there's of course a new player in the game, imaging, and post-mortem human brain stem here. You can see the pathways, even color-coded, but this is post-mortem. And there are scientists like the Brain Netome in the Chinese Academy of Science who do maps in some detail. And of course, the validation needs to be done fully yet on these works, but they claim to find a lot of detail, a lot of areas fall off with their approaches, and they might yet make histology irrelevant. But we are trying to follow up ourselves too with this, and you would be the best ones to judge this image, which is you're the first to see, because we hope to publish this work in a year or two. It's an atlas of MRI of the living human brain. Indeed, it is the brain of Mark Shira from the University of Wollongong, who is my collaborator in this, together with Steve Kassem. We think we've got images that are as good as any in the literature. On that basis, on that faith, we're proceeding to segment the human brain. It was a heroic effort on the part of Mark Shira, 40 hours over various sessions, of course, in the MRI to produce these images, which I hope might meet with your approval. And that's what we're doing right now. There are various contrasts. We examine concurrently, and we integrate the information from various means to construct an atlas now without distortions from extracting the brain from the calvarium. And now, going back to the question in the title, brain or mind, the question has social, legal, and religious implications. If the mind controls the brain, then there's free will and its corollaries, dignity and responsibility. You are the king in your skull-sized kingdom. You are the architect of your destiny. If, on the other hand, the brain controls the mind, an incendiary conclusion follows. There can be no free will, no praise, no retributive punishment, no purgatory. That's not so bad, of course, if there's no purgatory. And perhaps little hope for survival. Are we just our brain? Does the mind have no agency? It's the same thing as asking the question, know thyself. Who are we? And I'll go through some historical aspects of these concepts. And here we have Aesop praising the brain. The fox entered the house of an actor and rummaging over everything. She pulled a mask, a beautiful imitation of a human head. At that time, masks were heads. She put her paw on it and said, "What a beautiful head." Yet it's without any value because it's entirely without a brain. And without special examination, it is hard to infer that the brain creates the mind. The ancient Egyptians carefully preserved the heart, lungs, and other organs, but heedlessly discarded the brain, sending millennia of pharaohs brainless to their afterlife. It was Alcmaeon who first discovered the connection between the brain and the mind or the soul, and including the relation between psychological events and the body. And he was from Croton, and Magna Graecia, and from there, the information seemed to have passed on to Kos, where lived the greatest doctor of antiquity, Hippocrates. And Hippocrates presents an astoundingly modern view of the brain. Men ought to know that from the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests, as well as our sorrows, pain, griefs, and tears. Unfortunately, Aristotle, perhaps the greatest mind of antiquity, misjudged, and though he was following Hippocrates, and thought that the brain was there to cool the blood, air conditioning. And a professor's greatness is measured by how long his time is progress in his field. And in his case, it was a couple of thousand years. But there was opposition to this by Galen of Pergamon, because he calls in Pergamon, and he was an admirer of Hippocrates, and he presented the encephalocentric view of the soul against the cardiocentric view of Aristotle, and the two views battle each other out until the dawn of modern age. And you see in Shakespeare, Portia in the Merchant of Venice asks, "Tell me, where is fancy, fancy being love, bred, or in the heart, or in the head?" And if you look what people believe, you would be convinced that there's no room for love to have anything with the brain. I was confronted on February 14th in Bondi Junction by 300 Valentine's Day cards, each of them with at least one red heart, none of them with a brain. I was forced to write a letter to the conversation. Darling, I love you from the bottom of my brain. And an ABC journalist from Melbourne called me and she asked, are you insisting that the heart has nothing to do with love? I said, if in a heart transplant, I get your heart, I am not going to fall in love with your husband. She said, what a pity. And he's such a lovely man. I think with a big heart now transplants, I can predict safely that the recipient will not fall in love with the wife of the pig. And if you really want something that for Valentine's Day, ask Gary to give you one of these that is as pretty as anything, certainly as pretty as the heart, and it is also true. After such battle to localize the seat of the soul, psychology loses its soul in the 1930s. Heb, the mind is the integration of the activity of the brain. There's no ghost in the machine. Before giving a lecture on why psychology lost its soul, I asked people around in the lunch break before whether they had a soul. And the answer was invariably, pardon me, they couldn't believe the question. But eventually one one girl said to me, I had one until I did my PhD. No need for a soul for scientific considerations. If the soul is where emotion and motivation reside, where mental activity occurs, sensations are perceived, memories are stored, reasoning takes place, love is manufactured, decisions are taken, then there's no need to hypothesize its existence. There is an organ that already performs these functions. Now, if we assume for the moment that there's no need for the soul is surplus to requirements for psychology, and indeed, some argue that it's cruel to blame the soul for some misbehavior of children when they may have some short supply of dopamine or adrenaline or whatever else. But do we at least have free will? Who are we? Are we bereft of everything? And this question I also put to a lady who was sitting across from me in a cafe where I was writing my novel, and asked her if she had free will. And she said, I do, but I don't think many people do. And this is the paradox. People think that they have free will, but they doubt that the others have much of it. Well, many philosophers and neuroscientists think that behavior is the product of two and only two factors over which we have no control: genetic endowment and environmental influences on that endowment. The influences, of course, begin even before conception, even in the epigenetics from our grandmother, possibly, according to some rat studies. And therefore, we are genes sculpted by behavior, by the environment, according to some neuroscientists. Of course, these neuroscientists could be wrong, and the other ones could be right. These things are not proven. But for a moment, entertain the possibility that the environment sculpts character, just as this unknown artist, perhaps Phidias, sculpted Apollo from Parian marble in this statue from the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. Just consider that the environment sculpts character as Praxiteles sculpted Hermes. Neuroscientists agree that genes confirm predilections. Many consider the environment is the only sculptor of behavior. If only you could abandon our undesirable desires, our depression, our obsessions, our compulsions, our unrequited love. If only we were the authors of our thoughts and not mere observers of what the brain presents us. If only the puppet could get hold of one of the strings with which the brain makes it dance, it seems the puppet is free only in as much as it loves its strings. Many neuroscientists believe that we're slaves of yesterday. That is, the brain will make a decision today on the basis of the experience up to today. Today, of course, we might be exposed to something else. And tomorrow, interrogated on the same thing, our response could be different. But at any time, we're slaves of yesterday. The good thing for psychologists that they discovered is that today is tomorrow's yesterday. And therefore, they can intervene today, cognitively or otherwise, to assist the person to alter their behavior. The brain decides in neurological darkness, and it forces the mind, but the mind then thinks that it made the decision. In fact, the decision was made precognitively, according to many neuroscientists. For better or worse, Freud has been resurrected in a revised form of the all-important unconscious. Clem used this sentence to actually argue against the position that I present, but it's a nice sentence and I give him credit for it. Now, in the domain of love, who would disagree? L'amour est un enfant de bohème, n'a jamais connu de loi. In Spanish, there is a song that says, "Revuélveme mi amor para matarlo." Return me my love so I can kill it. Well, why does he have to return it? You killed yourself. No, that's not an easy thing. And if there's ever a strong datum in psychology, it must be this, that people have hard time getting rid of a love that abandoned them. And if we take this approach that there's no freedom, there will be different view of crime and punishment. There can be no retributive justice. There can be no hate. If only the scorned lovers would go to neuroscientists' talks, they would know that they cannot, that the person who abandoned them cannot anymore make herself love him, than he himself can make himself ditch the love that torments him. And this is not idle talk, because half of the people who are abandoned interfere with the person who abandoned them at their house, at the internet, at their work. Some of them hit her, some of them kill her, some of them commit suicide. If only they read some neuroscience, they would know that there's no freedom. And this is actually consistent with the view of Jesus on the cross, where he said, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And who is the puppet? Who is the puppeteer? If we agree that the brain is the puppeteer, then it's might as well find if it's the right size, because on it depends our survival. And the conclusion I've come to it is that if the brain was smaller, less clever, and capable of language than what it is, it would not have been able to produce the science and technology which today threaten existence. If the brain were larger than what it is, humans might have been able to comprehend the problem, even rectify it. The brain is just not the right size. And to avoid this epitaph, I thought we have to understand that of the hubris of human exceptionalism, and poor Sisyphus that insulted the gods by comparing himself to it, being egotistical, narcissistic, and insulting, and he was condemned to push a rock up the mountain. And there he is, and armed with the truth, and I quote in part here, E.O. Wilson, that we are standing puzzled before nature. We don't know why we're here. We have a brain with leftovers of the reptilian period. We have Paleolithic emotions, perhaps no soul, no free will, and the triple delusion that we have those, free will and soul. And indeed, we are made in the image of God. If that ever there was wasn't a hubris, and armed with the truth that we might change our course and steer for the dawn and not the grave of our children, and then make wings of our oars. And this was the reason I wrote this novel using neuroscience principles, because that's all I knew in the formation of characters. And if anybody wants to hear more about it, it's presented tomorrow at readings in Hawthorne. And I was frustrated because I lost every battle I tried on the environment. And you can see here the light rail effort. I used things that I learned from colleagues like His van Torck, and even in his suffering at the end. And it takes place in Mary's place, in Masada, in Israel, in Jerusalem. Here we see the crucifix in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And here the lit rocks of Golgotha, and the ornate lanterns, and the Holy Tomb. And the man facing the sky with eyes closed. They're really strong in their beliefs there. The Wailing Wall, East Jerusalem, Ithaca, where part of it takes place, the novel Piazza di Spagna, and St. Peter's Basilica, and Pantheon. This is really where the novel takes place. And a river divided, it is the Amazon. And it's Rio Salamois and Rio Negro. And they have different catchment areas, different temperature, different acidity, different color, but a destiny that is the same. And the story is about identical twins that are produced out of a formidable discovery in Israel, which results in their birth, but they are raised apart. And if I could read you from the back of the book, as different artists sculpt different statues from the same block of marble, different environments produce different characters, even in identical twins. And you can see there Buenos Aires, and the palace Cosa Rosada, and the cathedral of Buenos Aires, the medical school where the siege takes place, the students protesting against pollution and overpopulation, and the churches that are involved in the novel, the University of New South Wales, where something takes place. Here I have a photo with Cicina Ferreira, who is the first girlfriend of Che Guevara, who I described my conversation in the novel. And she died, unfortunately, this year. And thank you for listening to me, and may your brain not shrink. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you, George. Okay, so for our audience, please send in some questions. Now's your opportunity to ask probably the man who has authored a few books on your bookshelf right now, a couple of pressing questions. So Gary, do you want to start us off?
Sure, Shana. Yeah, look, we do have one that's come through in the Q&A. From Trang, you might have seen that. So George, there's a question there from the audience about if A River Divided is a novel, should we all treat the scientific facts in it seriously?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Indeed, I'm proud of one thing more than anything else. Might feel that it was done in 21 years of effort, and that is that someone who read an early version of this book, translated in Greek and published in Greece, was able to diagnose temporal lobe glioma in her friends. It was a a kindergarten teacher, on the basis of the symptoms described in the novel. So you actually can use the stain procedure described to stain your tissue, I can tell you. So, and a psychologist who read it actually wrote a review saying that the psychological aspects in the novel are correct. But if I could say about the effort to get things right in it, in 21 years, just before sending it to the publisher, a friend approached me at the cafe I was writing it, and she said, "How's the book?" I said, "Well, look, 21 years and still not finished." She said, "My cousin's novel was published posthumously." I said, "You're giving me hope." And on another occasion, when I was approaching a publisher to considering publishing for me, he said, "What is the about?" I said, "Look, it's identical twins raised apart. It's nature versus nurture. It is cloning Jesus Christ. It is about the environment. It's about ethics. And on what shelf would I place it?" Until that point, I was convinced of Woody Allen's dictum that if you are a bisexual, you double your chances for a rendezvous on a Saturday night.
Okay. George, I've got a couple of questions. The first one is in the spirit of your talk, and that is, do you know who initiated the sort of scurrilous inaccuracy that love is in the heart? Who got that wrong? And why isn't it been in the brain from day one?
Yeah, well, actually, Alcmaeon antedated Aristotle, but it really the Egyptians were the ones that discarded the brain through the nose and preserving the heart. So I presume it originated there, and of course the brain doesn't rattle. It might have, now knowing that it's annoying, it's easy to see that nature tried to protect the most important organ in bone. So it would have had some importance, but it doesn't rattle. And if you kiss, it's not the organ that's excited. Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
George, another question, a little bit more scientifically. Thinking about the Marmoset brain atlas work you did, and you referred to area 45 in the Marmoset. You pointed out that you're not claiming that it's the speech area in Marmosets, but like if there is an identifiable area, like a cytoarchitectonically identifiable area, then there must be a function associated with it. And presumably it's not the sort of, the motor control, speech motor control area, which is different than Broca's. Do you have any thoughts, or did you ever discuss that with anyone? What could be the function of that area in the Marmoset?
That's right. Well, that's a fundamental question. No, I don't know. It occurred to me too. Yeah, but I haven't asked Marcello. He might be the best person in the world to tell you, but as good as any anyway. Yeah, but in same way that the right part of the human brain that has 45 and 45B and deals with prosody, and it actually can detect prosody, and if you suffer damage there, then appreciation of prosody, the feeling that the difference between what's that thing called love? What's that thing called love? What's that thing called love? Appreciating the difference between the intonation, that is the function of the right corresponding to the Broca's area. So possibly it has some talents, but yeah, I don't know. It is an interesting question.
And a question about your forthcoming living human brain MR-DTI atlas, Mark Shearer's brain. Just out of interest, what resolution is it, and how does it stack up against the big brain from the McGill-Hewlett group, which is online, which is a 1 micron atlas, albeit a post-mortem brain? But what's the resolution of the one you're doing, and have you looked at trying to do that with a 7 Tesla scanner and go one better?
Yeah, that's right. We're using, Mark he has gone to Queensland and used the 7 Tesla scanner, and he's mixing it up with the 3 Tesla one. And apparently he gets benefits out of both. And it is 200 microns. 200 microns, that's right. So far inferior to 1 micron, but it is living and will be giving people what they actually see in front of them or when they examine their own subject or patient. Still, we don't know whether it will be relevant really at the end and who wins out at the end. And in this business, winner takes all often. And so the people in ULIC, Ammons and Alan Evans are interested in collaborating with us on these things. So I think they see some value in what we are doing as well.
Right, thanks, George. I've got another question, but we've got a couple now up in the chat. One from Marta Garrido. Not sure if you can read them, George. I'll read them out to you. If it's the brain that commands mind and behavior, there's no free will and there should be no blame, then what changes should there be in our justice systems?
That's right, that's fundamental. That certainly should not be retributive and it should be correctional institutions and not for revenge. That the emphasis should be in looking at the conditions that produce these things and not in punishing the individual, though punishment itself could be an example to someone who had in mind to go and kill someone, that look what happens to those who do kill. So the society has the right to incarcerate people, but it's really rehabilitation and not hate. It's hard to do that if somebody wrongs you. But if I could quote Einstein that said that Oppenheimer's view that there's no freedom, makes me reconcile myself with those who wronged me. So it is perhaps at least see that in fact, one of my characters in the novel does exactly that without wanting to reveal in the plot that he's wronged tremendously, and yet he forgives that person who did wrong him. This is what you can appeal to, again, going back to a great philosopher, Jesus Christ.
Thanks, George. We've got a question from Phyllis Chua. She's interested in understanding how you define the mind. And the second question is, with the new atlas, do you think it'd be time at some stage to do one of a human female rather than all these male atlases that you've been doing for decades?
Yeah, well, you're right. And if you want to work with me, please do all the preliminary work and I can assist you with delineations. It is just like solving a puzzle. Once you identify Switzerland, you will find out where Germany, Italy, Austria, France is. So it's really interesting, but somebody has to do the work. And it was one of us that went through this. But the other question about the mind, yeah, well, it is a fundamental question, what that means. And of course, Hebb gave the definition that mind is the integration of the activity of the brain. But I was asked by the group of judges, one of them, because I was asked to give a presentation to them. They didn't know what was coming to them. They just wanted a taste of neuroscience. But the lady said to me, Justice asked, okay, the mind, what happens after death to the mind? And that is a fundamental question, right? Are we substituted soul with the word mind, and then we're happy? I mean, that we have to front up to the judges, right? And so what I said to her is that just consider, if you suffer damage to this part of the visual cortex, you have a color deficit on the lower left visual field. If you suffer damage to the parietal lobe on the right side, you have contralateral sensory neglect. You don't see things on the left side of the visual field. If you suffer damage to the frontal lobes, you have inability to plan for the future, a lack of inhibition. And I said, can you imagine then or even Alzheimer's disease, that while then, where the mind correspondingly shrinks, where you don't know who you are, your name, your children, that can you imagine my brain rotting in the funerary casket and yet my soul flying off to heavens? It's just hard to argue that.
Thanks so much, George. I do know that you've got to leave. You've got an interview, I believe, fairly soon this afternoon. I do have one final, perhaps a point to make to you, just that I think it'd be really great to explore the possibilities of doing a chemoarchitectonic atlas, as you would know from, again, the work in Mulek with Katrina Muntz and others, the potential of doing that now with MRI PET scanners and even the next generation of ultra high resolution brain PET scanning, I think means re-looking at those chemoarchitectonic atlases would be very valuable. Interested in your quick thought on that, George?
Oh, that'd be lovely. That's a great idea. And if you come up with some collaboration, and may I just thank you for also the collaboration for making me part of the Excellence Center of Excellence that you did, and for guiding, steering this project so well over the years.
Thanks, George. I just want to clarify, if you like, the time and place for your book launch or book reading tomorrow.
Thank you.
I understood it was 6:30 p.m. tomorrow evening, Thursday, at Readings in Hawthorne.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, if they want to put my name and Readings, they will find it and then they can register.
Okay. And are you actually doing a reading from part of the book, or?
Yes, somebody will be. Yes.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you. Well, thanks, George. I'll pass back to Shani now.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary and George. So that is the end of today's webinar. So we hope that you've all enjoyed it. You can see our social media links right behind me here. And I invite you to join us for our next webinar on the 25th of May, where we'll have Gary Egan speaking again, but this time with Dr. Maggie Alsobrook, where he'll be speaking about the Australian Precision Medicine Enterprise, growing a world-class precision medicine industry. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.